All right, welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started for today. This is our second class meeting for communication and social change. This is also a Monday, Wednesday class, so this will be our last meeting of the week, and we'll pick up again next Monday. We do have a new face in the class. We'll be introducing us in just a little bit. So I think that's everybody here that's here for the first time today. ALC returning. I think we also have Andrew, who will be joining us soon. So I'm glad to have everybody back. Is Nigmo, correct? Yeah. We spent some time having people introduce themselves to the group, tell us a little bit about themselves, and kind of express why they're interested in taking the course. Had a lot of people who are interested in sort of how to apply and use social change or get better at communication. So a lot of different reasons that people are interested in this class. So I'll give you a second if you want, and then you're welcome to share a little bit about yourself.
Do I have to stand up or?
No need to stand up, yeah.
So hi everyone, my name is Nigma. Something people might not, I don't know. What might you guys not know about me? I don't like math. I don't know if you guys are thinking like, oh, this guy probably likes math, but I honestly don't know. What interests me about this course? Honestly, I didn't know what I wanted to do coming into this university. Mm-hmm. I was under the liberal arts major back in my previous college. Mm-hmm. I got my Associates of Arts 2-year degree on liberal arts, but I didn't feel like continuing a somewhat gen ed course here, but I did somewhat enjoy my communication classes back in Palau. That's where I'm from. And yeah, that's why I'm a communications major, by the way. Yeah. That's why I'm taking these courses.
In communication. Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I'm really glad that you have chosen to kind of continue with courses here. So I introduced myself to folks, there's a number of folks who have taken a couple classes with me before. So I'm an assistant professor of communication. I'm also the co-chair of the communication department. I do a lot in kind of rhetoric, social advocacy. I do health communication and disability. And it sounds like, you know, this class would be a really good fit. I mean, I think that this is a course that I first time running it this fall, and is a course we're hoping to have. It's the Diversity, Power, and Difference credit. And we'll be talking a lot about social movements, social change, how we advocate for social change, how we think about a lot of these kind of current events, hot button issues, social and political topics, and how to build skills in addressing and navigating those challenges. So I'm really glad to have you here and have you joining us. With that, let's go ahead and get rolling on some of the stuff for today. So as a quick recap, we introduced each other, went over some of the policies and syllabus for the course, right? And started to define and explain what social movements and social change are. Does anybody have any questions about anything on the syllabus or anything that we talked about in the class more generally? I'd like to dedicate a bit of space to do that at the start of every class. I will also be happy to answer any questions if you like want to raise your hand or give me a holler at any point, right? Just to give you a sense of how things are structured, right? This is a class that meets for like an hour and 15 minutes, but I also know that chunk can be really grueling. So I will typically have about a 10-minute break around the half of each class. We'll also oftentimes get done like a few minutes early. And I like to break things up by doing videos, by doing partner and group activities, right? You will not be hearing me talk at you for nearly 2 hours. Again, cruel and unusual punishment. Constitution says I can't do that. So just to give you a sense of what to expect structurally. Also, just so you know, I have all of the things for this course that are just linked on that front page of Canvas. Also have a fun video that started before it's supposed to, apparently. So on the front page of Canvas, right, there's a document we worked on last time, kind of going over social change, the syllabus right here. I have office hours, both face-to-face and through Zoom. And then there's the schedule and all of that stuff. I do have that first, so we have weekly Canvas prompts. The first prompt is due this Friday, but you can choose to complete any 6 out of the 8 prompts in the class, however you'd like. And then the readings are by the end of the week. So just so you know there. So a couple quick reminders. That first Canvas activity is due by midnight on Friday. I wanted to make it a little bit clearer on Canvas about the due dates for the readings, right? So the readings line up with the Canvas prompts. So in other words, I added this here at the bottom. So by this Friday, even though we're not meeting for class, I'm asking you to complete these 2 readings and then complete that Canvas prompt that'll be connected to those readings. We'll also be talking about and kind of building off of the ideas from those readings in class. But it's still a good idea to go through those readings. The Aristotle one, I do recommend just kind of skimming through. I'll be hitting on some of the major points in class today. There's a good chance you've read it for another class, so you don't need to give it a whole big look for today. The Canvas prompt is asking you to identify how a social movement of your choice is using rhetoric and how it's falling under the steps that Griffin talked about in that article. The way that I've done these Canvas prompts, right, is I break the prompt up into like 3 different parts and sections. And then I italicize how your quotes break down and how you receive a certain number of points in that assignment. It doesn't need to be turned in with formal citations, right? It doesn't need to be a big essay. In fact, I recommend just 2 or 3 paragraphs is totally fine, right? It can be more informal. I'm looking for, clearly answering the question and incorporating ideas from the class in your response. I'm also happy to look over drafts or outlines of this assignment if you want to send it to me in advance and would like some feedback on it ahead of time. And then I mentioned that the textbook for this class is something that you'll need starting next week, right? That quick reading, I definitely recommend the Amazon ebook. It's the easiest way to go. It's about $35 just to get the ebook. You can also order a paper copy either from the bookstore or online, or, right, you could also find an opportunity to share with other folks in the class and maybe divide up the cost. Again, I like to reduce costs whenever possible. If you're having trouble accessing next week's readings, please let me know. The readings that are outside of the book, so readings such as Griffin for this week, as well as some of the other ones, such as the Hyman reading, just have the links. The other ones that say Crick next to them are from that textbook, so they don't have the direct links to them. So the last thing is just that the attendance, right? You have 3 you can miss for any reason. Outside of that, I'm asking you to complete the makeup assignment. If, like Andrew, you can't attend face-to-face for any reason, but you still want to come in, let me know, and I will send you a link for that. Awesome. Any questions on any of that? Great. Yes.
So to attend through Zoom, as if you were here, or do you have to do that assignment?
Yeah. So it depends on participation, right? So, if you're out of town, if something's come up and you're able to like participate in like some of the activities and things that we do in class, You'll be able to receive attendance if you only are able to like kind of just follow along and are able to jump in, like say you're on a drive somewhere, then I'll still ask you to complete that makeup assignment. But it'll help in that case since you can see it live rather than having to go back and see the video. It's a good question. I also upload those recordings from classes right after class. So Monday's video is up, and that's an easy way to catch up on things. And I keep the slides up after class too. Good question. Any others? Okay. Again, I apologize for some of the housekeeping, but I think getting out of the way is useful. So for today, I want to take some time to crash course and talk about this idea of rhetoric. What is rhetoric? What is persuasion? Why do these things matter? And how do these things influence the way that we think about social change? How many people have taken a course that focuses on like rhetoric, or a course that has had a good chunk of time on that? Okay. So about 2 or 3. So some of this might be review, but I do think it's good ground to cover, and I'm going to try to contextualize it to social change and social movements. For those of you that are doing a bit of a refresher here. We'll also be talking a bit about the Griffin piece. Specifically, this was kind of the first big piece studying social movements and social change in a communication way. So we'll be talking about sort of how this lays the groundwork and to what extent we can still get some things out of it, and how we can use rhetoric and persuasion to understand the present. You know, some of the challenges, some of the movement, some of the persuasion that we're seeing now. A lot of people talked about, you know, campaigns such as usage of online activism, things like Black Lives Matter, things such as organizations like PETA, animal rights, right? A lot of these movements are using rhetoric in ways that might or might not be considered to be especially persuasive and effective. An effective organization, an effective social change is the result of generations of trial and error of leadership and work that has helped to develop the most effective messaging, but is also work that has had to respond to the changing world and the changing way that things like media impact our communication. Before we dive into some of those things, I do want to just alert you briefly about some of the resources that are available on campus to help you out. Again, I know a lot of you, this isn't your first rodeo, so I know that you're somewhat familiar with some of these, but I do think that accessing some of these resources is really useful. In particular, I didn't actually know until this year that there is an online tutoring service that you can really easily access, where all you've got to do is log in. We've got a bunch of different courses covered, including communication, and you can be set up with a tutor, either through live tutoring through Zoom, tutoring face-to-face through the Learning Lab and Writing Center. And another cool feature is that you can ask questions online and do that too. Since a lot of you might be juniors or seniors, one opportunity that you could also consider if you're interested is becoming a tutor yourself. It's a great career and resume builder, and getting in touch with the tutoring center on campus is a great way to get involved through that and support your fellow students. So thought I would make a plug for that. The Writing Center on campus is really useful as well. It's down the hall in Rosso. It's got a lot of things that you can do, like meeting with a tutor. And another thing that I find really helpful about this one is the set of handouts, which has a whole bunch of information about how to develop thesis statements, how to structure your essays, and do all of those fun things. So even if you just want a quick refresher, I think those are great resources. Again, I'm also available to look over drafts, outlines, anything else, but I just wanted to point you to those things that I think can be a really great way to support you in your classes. Like I mentioned on Monday, right? Think about your classes. If things get out of hand and it starts to feel like a fire, right? Those resources, getting in touch with me will help put it out. Don't let the fire burn the house down. So all of those things, I think, will help as you're gearing up for your courses. Also, right, just a quick thing about notes. Since we don't have any midterms or exams for this course, right? I'm not looking at do you memorize, do you know how to define a thing. I'm looking more at your ability to form connections, to apply, to use, to analyze some of these ideas, right? I do recommend keeping whatever prompts or activities that you use for attendance on a separate sheet, right? The way I do attendance is I'll ask you to do either independently, either in groups or in partnerships, some type of activity or prompt to turn in, and then just make sure that you've got that on a separate sheet of paper then where you keep your normal notes so that you don't lose those. Since I have the slides available, you don't need to get everything down word for word, right? Focus on those big aha moments, the things that stand out to you as especially exciting or interesting, or the things that connect to areas that you're interested in. The Cornell method is a really useful way of organizing notes. Having a title that is specific, right? One easy way to do that is to pull the title from the table on Canvas, the date, and then listing some of the general ideas on one side and some of the things that were talked about over the course of the class in a more free-flowing way on the other is one model of taking notes. You don't have to do it, but I think it can be a really helpful way to organize all of that. All right. I always have a couple folks who are a little bit unsure of like how to take notes for classes or for this class in particular, so I like to get that out of the way. Any other questions? All right. So I like to frame this by starting to talk about what I see as the challenge of talking about social change. And us as students, right, we are effectively researchers and scholars in the practice of social change, right? And one of the challenges is this question of being involved as an activist or advocate within a campaign or movement or change, and being interested in studying its goals, being involved in the process. And there's another question about studying it as a researcher, as a scholar, as a student, right? Because those are very different worlds, right? And they're carefully connected, but it can definitely be a big challenge to figure out to what extent do you detach, zoom out, and analyze in a somewhat objective way, and to what extent do you find yourself on the ground, involved, and participating? One of the challenges is the ethics of doing so, right? So here at EOU, we have what's known as the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board. How many folks have ever used the IRB or had to go through an IRB training? A couple of you, right? So whenever you're doing research that involves human subjects, right? So you're studying people, whether you're observing or conducting an experiment, right? The idea is that you have to receive approval and submit your proposal before you can do research. How many people have ever heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment? Yeah, people in my health comm class, a few others, right? This was from Philip Zimbardo, and it was a case where people were randomly assigned the roles of prisoner or warden, and they were basically doing kind of a mock prison system where people were in prison for a period of a few weeks, and they were trying to understand human psychology in that experiment. But that was not an ethical experiment because people had long-term psychological damage in that setting, right? As a result, among other changes, they created this institutional review board to study and to analyze and make sure that something is approved, is ethical, it's not damaging to people before doing research. So here's where I'm going with that, right? For this class, one of the challenges is how we speak about and how we engage with communities for social change. We might think that it's ethical to talk about a group that we are a part of or to discuss the advocacy strategies, but oftentimes a lot of members of a group hold those really close to their hearts, right? They are specific and they are tactical, and they're not meant for the broader public. So one of the challenges of studying social movements and social change is figuring out the ethics and navigating the ethics about talking about the change that other people do. In fact, there has been criticism that if we uncover and explore how people advocate for social change, that individuals opposed to that change can use that information in such a way that they can shut down these efforts of social change or make them less effective, right? So there's a lot of these ethical challenges here, and I want to put in that background because while understanding and making sense of social change is important, it's also important to do so in a way that is sensitive to the communities and groups that we are speaking about and that engages in that way, right? Depending on the group that you're a part of, some people might feel frustrated. Like, this is a space for you. We don't want a researcher here talking about what we do, right? So That tension is definitely something that we'll see at play in this class. What does it mean to study a social movement or social change as an outsider, or even as somebody that is a member of that group and trying to make sense of your own participation within it? So to zoom out a little bit more, let's start out by talking about rhetoric, what it is and why it matters for this class. So somebody who has taken a class that talked about rhetoric before, what is rhetoric in your own words? How would you define rhetoric? Yeah. Yeah, right. Persuasion, particularly persuasion towards an audience, right? Another concern are the resources or things that you have that allow you to do that persuasion. Okay? So when we hear the word rhetoric, I think we hear that word used a lot to describe like noise and debate and argument, right? So we might imagine candidates for president who are like yelling or arguing with each other, right? Oftentimes we'll hear people say, that's just rhetoric, or critiquing the rhetoric that's being used. So when we mean rhetoric, we don't necessarily mean that in a negative or pejorative way. We don't mean, oh, people are yelling at each other, that's rhetoric, right? We're focused on persuasion. So rhetoric, according to Aristotle, going all the way back to the Greeks, again, I'm trying to contain some of this stuff from Aristotle just for the first week, so we can get on to more contemporary work. But Aristotle defined and sort of established rhetoric as the available means of persuasion. That's something that you'll hear a lot if you take a class like public speaking, right? In other words, and thinking about this in the context of social change, right? What do we have in the moment that can impact our communication and allow us to resolve or address an issue, right? So I did speech and debate going all the way back many decades before I was born, right? Before computers were available, at debate tournaments, they would have tubs, these like massive tubs that just had like research, evidence, and data, right? So when you'd have students go to debate tournaments, what they would do is take those massive tubs with them, and before debate started, they would pull the evidence from those tubs that they could put together to use to support the points in their speech, right? And the idea is that they are literal available means. They are the pieces of evidence that you're pulling out of the tub to create your speech. One kind of funny story about that is former Vice President Dick Cheney was a college debater, and he used tubs, but he used to do a thing where he had a bunch of empty tubs that were like vials, right, that were just completely empty, and try to get as many tubs as he could and show those around just to posture and make it look like his team had way more evidence than everybody else. Beside the point, kind of silly. So rhetoric, right, refers to what we have in order to persuade and convince other people, right? Taking stock on those issues or how advocates and activists create effective social change, right? They might have a Twitter handle, they might have YouTube, they might have Facebook, right? They might be out on the streets. Who are they in communication with? Oftentimes journalists and people that cover and talk about an issue are important connections to form in advocating for social change, right? In fact, leading up to passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, one of the ways in which this actually got implemented was because an occupation of the Capitol building in Sacramento was covered by a local journalist and was actually accidentally aired on primetime television. And it was due to that circulation and that relationship with that journalist that happened to spread more widely that the word got out and that information got known, right? So in thinking about rhetoric and persuasion, again, the proofs and genres, you might be familiar with them, but I think it's good to do a quick refresher on some of these. So there are three what are known as artistic proofs. If you're like me and you're a big fan of Star Trek, right? There is the character Spock, who is half Vulcan. Vulcans are alien species that suppress their emotions and believe that they should only use logic. Aristotle and the Greeks thought that ideally we should just be like Spock and we should have control over emotions and reach logical decisions. But It's not how humans are. And honestly, if you talk to people that say we should use logic on the internet, it's really annoying really fast. Just go down to any comment section. People who want to debate you using logic are incredibly annoying. So these three artistic proofs involve ethos, pathos, and logos, right? And we use these all the time. Activists and advocates use them all the time, right? I should also note, right? Activist implies more of an on the ground, like you are a person that is protesting and participating. Advocate involves more of a role as an ally and is generally focused on more social or political change. So I use those terms distinctly to describe sort of the two different roles people have. So ethos involves an appeal to credibility, right? If you are trying to, for instance, provide more access to clean drinking water, you might say, as an economics professor at MIT explained, access to clean drinking water improves the economy, and here's why, right? So you're drawing from your own research background and experience to make your argument. You're appearing informed, you're appearing successful, right? If we think about things such as the civil rights movement, right? One thing that immediately probably comes to mind for us are a lot of the figures within that movement, people such as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? Those are examples of how the credibility and authority of that speaker has informed the way that we think about historical movements, even though there's a variety of factors and a variety of figures that, of course, are present there as well. Pathos is an appeal to human emotion, right? Pathos is used a whole lot to describe the experiences of people who are personally impacted by policies, politics, and similar topics, right? Going back to our discussion on Monday, the personal and political. The issues that can impact us personally and proximally are issues that happen in conjunction with political and social topics, right? Regardless of where you find yourself falling on some of those issues, I think it's worth noting, right, that those ways are used to frame issues. Easy example is abortion, right? You have people who are using signs, are using demonstrations and visuals, people who are saying things such as, you know, it is a crime to have and be forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy, and people who say, you know, every life starts at conception, you're killing babies, etc., right? Regardless of where you find yourself on that topic, the use of this very emotionally charged language is a rhetorical strategy, right? Or we think about those sad commercials that are used, like they're in black and white, they play sad guitar music. There's like, you know, a shelter that wants you to adopt pets. It's also famous. Logos is appeals to logic, right? So an easy way to think about this is the syllogism. If A equals B and B equals C, then C equals A. So, right, this building does not have access to an elevator. Accessibility guidelines require an elevator. Therefore, this building violates accessibility guidelines, right? You have two different premises, and if those premises are met, you reach a conclusion. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? And those are used too, right? You're trying to make a logical argument for something. So these proofs, depending on the context or situation, are used to advocate for social and political change. We also have what are known as genres, right? And I think that we can think about these all being at play, depending on the movement, depending on the context, and depending on the situation. These images are probably very familiar to us, right? Pictured here on the left is George Floyd. Pictured here on the right is Derek Chauvin, right? This is the case of that sparked, you know, a whole lot of discussions surrounding Black Lives Matter, surrounding issues of race and racism, issues of police, law enforcement, right? Again, regardless of where you fall on this topic, this is seen as an incredibly significant issue. And we can see all three of these genres at play. Forensic is focused on the past, right? In other words, think about like CSI, crime shows, similar things like that, right? It's focused on gathering evidence and making a case as to what happened. If we think about George Floyd case, there is a whole lot of discussion surrounding questions as to whether or not how the approach occurred, whether or not their children was in danger, right, or at risk, right? All of those areas were being debated in a forensic case in the court of law, right, and trying to decide what happened. And obviously, of course, that doesn't always, as we see in a lot of different cases, right, that can go a lot of different ways. Epididactic, try saying that one 3 times fast, is about celebration or censure in the present, right? So it is present oriented. In other words, holding something like a vigil or memorial service would be an example of epididactic or ceremonial rhetoric, right? You know, a common phrase that I heard discussed was that when George Floyd called to his mother, right, all mothers came or all mothers were summoned. Right? That would be an example of in the moment oriented rhetoric. Deliberative is focused on the future, right? It is a question of what we should be doing in terms of policy, in terms of action, in terms of behavior, right? And where we see a lot of that discussion is surrounding issues of race and racism in America, and also, right, issues of police presence, how much funding or allocation or support should be given to the police relative to other services, right? And again, that gets very heated, that gets very charged, that oftentimes gets very factually detached, but it is an example of using deliberative communication that may or may not be focused on specific policy. So here's what I think is the important and I think the increasingly thorny part about thinking about rhetoric in the context of communication and social change. Rhetoric requires a leap, and that leap is harder and harder to make, right? We know that in the United States, political polarization has significantly increased. There are, on average, fewer independent voters, right, between major parties. We also know that on a lot of social issues, people find themselves more sedimented in their views. One of the challenges of communication for social change is the discrepancy between communication that sounds persuasive and seems right versus communication that is moving or changing perspective, right? In other words, according to Aristotle, rhetoric requires somebody to start somewhere and end up somewhere else. Somebody has to jump from this building over here to this building over here, right? People have to change their perspective, point of view, or opinion to wind up somewhere different than where they started, right? And that's not necessarily every situation in which communication can be used. In fact, we often hear the word rallying used to describe building up or reinforcing support among a group of people who already believe something, right? But rhetoric generally requires us to move somebody or sway somebody else. And one of the challenges of doing that is of finding a population or group of people that is capable of being moved, right? In thinking about things like the presidential debates or a lot of congressional debates that have happened, right, it oftentimes seems like the candidates are on different planets, speaking very differently. And oftentimes, right, it's not necessarily about trying to convince somebody from the other party who's probably not going to move. It's about trying to sway an independent vote. In other words, in any given situation, we have an audience or people that we're addressing, like in media, right? It's getting out there, it's getting into the ether, might or might not be picked up. And when we have what are known as members of the rhetorical audience, that is, people that are capable of being persuaded, right? So if, for instance, you're talking about COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccination, and you're talking to somebody who strongly disagrees with you and is unwilling to change their perspective, right? That would probably fall outside of the rhetorical audience. And I think that a lot of effective leaders and members of communication for social change know this, right? They are strategic about who they're targeting, how they're targeting them, and how they're making their message known and using persuasion. So I think that one of the things that's really useful and important to follow is, are you the intended audience? Because oftentimes you're not, right? What is the goal here? What is the strategy? And how are people trying to reach that audience in a particular way, right? For instance, It could be a jury, trying to convince a jury about the guilt or innocence of a person. Again, it could be independent voters, it could be pressure on lawmakers, right, or members of Congress. One really big example of this is US Senator Joe Manchin, right, who is sort of the 50th Democrat and is generally seen as the most moderate member of the US Senate. So oftentimes, right, Republicans will try to get him to support or oppose policy. Democrats will do the same. So oftentimes communication might be very specifically catered to West Virginia in a way that is meant to specifically appeal to his needs, right? So who you're trying to reach and how you're trying to reach them is an important consideration. One thing, right, that, for instance, a lot of activists mentioned in the context of Black Lives Matter and the context of a lot of the protests that followed was to really try to discourage protesters from, destroying buildings, destroying cars, etc., out of a fear that individuals who did that would take the focus and scope away from sort of the focus on protest, right? That oftentimes an instance of violence becomes the story. So oftentimes you have a lot of people who have been involved in social change for a very long time who are identifying those issues as potentially derailing the message that's intended, right? There's very much, as an early member of an existing movement or group, an urge to understand your place and role within that group and not to act out of turn with that group, especially early on. So what I'd like you to do is, and you do not need to turn this in, I'd like you to think about a time that you were recently persuaded or convinced about something, right? It doesn't need to be a big thing, right? It doesn't need to be a huge view or perspective that you shifted on. It could be something as simple as, I didn't like this movie, I didn't like this show, I didn't like this food, now I do, or vice versa. Or I didn't know if I should give track and field a try, I did, and I loved it, right? But I want you to think about just something, whether it's major or minor, that you now feel differently about than you might have before. Right? And what I want you to think about in that way is to think about what it was in that moment that you found persuasive. What was the thing that moved the needle for you? And try to pinpoint what that thing is. I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about and brainstorm this a little bit. And I'm going to ask folks to share, what was the thing that kind of persuaded or helped to move the dial for you on a particular topic or issue, right? Give you one example. My mom's a vegetarian, and she loves to tell the story of how she became a vegetarian because she was kind of out on the farm and there was a cow that licked her face, right? And she uses that story and talks about that specific experience over and over to explain her perspective. folks would like some more time to continue to think about this? So I'm going to ask us to go around and as you share sort of the thing that persuaded you, just remind us your name, since we're still getting to know each other and learning a bit more about each other. So let's start over here on this.
So I have a dog in California back home, and I was going to move over here, but he's really attached to my mom. So my mom was basically like using photos to convince me to like keep him over there. And so I decided that it was best for me to stay back home.
You know this really close bond between your mom and the dog, and well, okay, so, right, that addresses whatever.
I'm Britt, and I used to not like onions, and then one day me and my roommate were making dinner, and we had like the HelloFresh that comes with everything. She's like, "Oh, do you want to add onions?" And I was like, "No, I don't really like onions." And she's like, "Well, if they add a lot of flavor and they really good, maybe you can add a little bit and see if you can try it." And now I get onions on like almost all my sandwiches.
Yeah, that's that way about avocado. It's you get that introduction, really get to try it in a good way. It helps.
I guess last year, I was debating whether or not to come back and take my co-major of eligibility. And so I would talk to my friends and they would remind me of the good side of it, emotional side. So
Yeah. Remind us your
I'm Niall.
Yeah, right. The ability to remember the good things about something can be really powerful. Move on back here.
My name is Laura, and it was earlier this year. My sister had asked if I wanted a dog for my birthday, and I didn't want to because I've never taken care of a dog. But my roommate somehow convinced me, like, no, we'll take care of it. So I kind of regretted it a little halfway through because they didn't help me take care of this dog. But no. But yeah.
Yeah, the feeling of security of, okay, they can take care of the dog, like you've got
Yeah. All right. Oh, I know. And over the summer, I was persuaded to actually come back to EW for just to come back. I was really debating on either going to a different school or just taking a year off to figure myself out. But I was persuaded by people I know from here and then asked my family as well. Just I already have ties here, and just they would help and support me get through at least another year here. And so far they're good. And I'm not regretting the decision yet.
That's good. I'm glad you're here.
Jason, when I was in more middle school years, I only played 2 sports, and my friends, they always told me to play baseball. I absolutely hated baseball. I tried to board one thing in a row, but I mean, after like a couple practices, maybe winning was one of my favorite things to play. I really still in it, you know?
You start to get into it or find something that you like within it. I think that really helps a lot. For sure.
My name is Angela, and I recently got ACL surgery, and I was mainly persuaded to get it sooner rather than later. And what made me agree to getting it sooner was my doctor telling me that if I don't get it sooner, then when I get older, I might not be able to walk.
Oh, wow.
Or I would walk well. Yeah.
My mom recently went through knee replacement surgeries for both knees and was told kind of something similar, right? The urgency of needing to make a change and the impact of not doing so.
Man, a lot of guys are so realistic and important, right? Makes mine feel really. So yeah, what I was persuaded was to start watching anime. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. Growing up, I used to think it's probably boring, it's for kids, and I thought it was lame before, but then one of my friends persuaded me. He's like, okay, so you like playing video games, you like the over the top action and all. So it's like, I think he was using logos like logic in comparison, like, okay, so you like this. So in terms, you should like that. I just never gave it a chance before. So then he like persuaded me, and just early college is when I started actually watching, and I actually really enjoyed that form of media. So
yeah, sometimes you just need that little push from somebody. You need to do something, like an entry into something. I know you're not into this, but you should try this one, right?
So I really want a sparkling water grocery store, but I'm very money aware. I don't want spending money. It freaks me out. So I was on the phone with my mom for some reason. Like, oh, that looks really good. What looks good? Oh, the sparkling water. Just use my credit card to buy it because I have a credit card for emergencies. And then she convinced me by saying, like, sometimes we need things to make us happy, and then also my birthday was coming up. It's like, yeah, you can spend $4 on a birthday present for yourself.
Oh, I feel really guilty now. I'm very sorry. No, but I think that, when somebody kind of shares that value, like, hey, you should deserve this, or you should enjoy this, right? That there's something about the freeing feeling that comes with that. Really, really persuasive.
My name is Priscilla, and my persuasion actually happened last night. So I don't like watching football. I think it's boring. But because my friends were talking about going to the season this weekend, and they just connected me because they showed me how it was last year, and some of the activities that they did during the game. And then they also use like heated emotions, like, because they said it's fun. It's not necessarily about completely just like watching the game, rather doing everything else while you watch it.
Yeah, again, having that way to be kind of invited into a space or into an activity that feels comfortable and feels like it addresses your concerns.
All right, so I'm Zach. That's my excusing example from yesterday. I didn't want to take an ice bath on the practice.
Yeah.
My roommates or my teammate kind of reminded me how much I complain about my body hurting. And I was like, all right, get my butt in my back. Oh, terrible.
Yeah, right. It's like, okay, I don't like this. I don't want to do this, but this helps.
And then, okay, so my name's Kiana, and mine was still very good as well. So I'm trying to eat like cleaner, just for my health. And my roommates were like, "You want to get candy at the gas station?" And I told them no at first, because I had no milk. And then they were like, "Come on, like could be like that." And then my FOMO kicked in, so my human emotion kind of got the best of me. I was like, "You know what, screw it. I want to the gas station. I want candy."
I think it's interesting to see things both directions. People saying, I wanted to do this healthier thing, or I was told to do this healthier thing, but I did something fun, or people who wanted to do something healthier, right? So I think a lot of the examples, right, are pretty lighthearted. I think it's kind of fun, right? And a little bit silly sometimes, but I think that the through line between some of the things that you shared is a useful way for us to think more broadly about persuasion and about persuasion that works, right? When we're advocating on something more serious and pressing topic, a lot of these same principles apply. Some of the things that I noticed that you all talked about were a feeling of making sure that your needs have been met before you go and agree to do something, right? Making sure that people know how to take care of your dog before you leave your dog with somebody else, right? That same principle of feeling personal security as sort of a precursor to what you do is important as an advocacy or activist, right? Because a lot of folks who are advocating on behalf of an issue with whom they do not feel security have this heightened challenge of trying to explain that lack of security and that lack of well-being or survival that is not felt in the same personal way to other people, right? So people who are saying, I really need a home for my dog, right, might not understand the challenge of making sure that the dog isn't taken care of properly, and the challenges of not having a good pet. In the same way, right, people who come from a historically marginalized or resilient perspective oftentimes find themselves struggling to make the case for their survival to people who do not feel or experience that in the same way, right? Sort of breaking down and acknowledging the lived experience of somebody else and the challenges that somebody else's experience are not understood firsthand can make it difficult for that outsider to be put in, to care, to be an advocate, to learn that you don't have to necessarily personally be impacted to still support a particular cause or group of people. And in fact, it's oftentimes coalitions that can really help to create a lot of those changes too, right? Another through line that I noticed were a lot of people who were talking about how being able to try or get into something in a more safe or non-confrontational way is a really good entry point for broader change, right? So a lot of groups about social change and about similar topics might try to invite people or initiate people into their group, share some of the details about what they do, and oftentimes we'll frame things around common values and beliefs, right? So saying things such as, we all believe in this sort of notion of freedom, but people don't get access to freedom due to this legal restriction or issue, right? And another way of thinking about some of the through lines that you all had is to think about the ways in which persuasion is very much tied to values, right? The values that our parents or family members have, values that we have developed or cultivated over time, right? Oftentimes, good communication is communication that's speaking to specific values and needs of the population, sees as especially important. And one thing that's been kind of evident over the last several years, based on like political party and orientation, it's been found that the order list of priorities between parties has looked very, very different. So I think thinking carefully about the values and beliefs of a group of people and how you can directly speak to or address those values and beliefs is important, right? We're unwilling to take a leap between two buildings. We're not confident in our ability to jump or don't think it's safe to make that jump, right? So dealing with this feeling of comfort, dealing with the inevitable discomfort that comes with changing a perspective or opinion on an issue, and facilitating a space for that change to be made, well, that's the challenge, right? And some movements are specifically saying that we're not doing the work of preparing you. That's work that you need to do for yourself, right? So that's an important consideration is how do we facilitate a space for somebody to make that, or how are we expecting a person to make that change, right? Are we expecting somebody to make a change? And if we're not, what is the goal of this movement otherwise? So I'm going to pause and give you all a short break. We'll pick back up talking about the Griffin piece and talking a little bit about social movements. I'm going to have us do a couple of group activities related to that. So feel free to grab a drink, use the restroom, whatever you'd like. We will continue to pick up on this at about 2. So I had a short video that kind of goes over some of the different elements of ethos, pathos, logos, some of those proofs, but it seems like people have a good sense of that and know kind of what to look for there. So I'm not going to have us go over everything again. It's useful if you want to kind of refresh yourself there. But there was something that I wanted to note from this video.
Or statistics. But it's not just facts and figures. It's also the structure and content of the speech itself. The point is to use factual knowledge to convince the audience, as in Sojourner Truth's argument for women's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? Unfortunately, speakers can also manipulate people with false information that the audience thinks is true, such as the debunked but still widely believed claim that vaccines cause autism. And finally, pathos appeals to emotion, and in our age of mass media, it's often the most effective mode.
So I wanted to highlight just that part of the clip that talks a little bit about the importance of structure, right? For a speech or presentation, that oftentimes for a presentation to work or to flow together, right, we have to believe or accept the initial premises or assumptions that get us from point A to point C, right? So oftentimes we see disagreement and debate on topics that emerge as a result of just simply not factually agreeing with it, right? Or if somebody expresses a point of view that we immediately disagree with and kind of shut down from listening to the rest of, it doesn't matter how persuasive or convincing the rest of their claim might be, right? The same way that we want to kind of dip our toes in or feel comfortable with something, right? If we're going to try anime for the first time, we watch something that's a little bit comfortable or easy to watch or not super complicated, right? We oftentimes find ourselves more willing to be persuaded if it starts with premises and ideas that we believe, ideas that we agree with, and so forth. And again, one thing that the Greeks, including Aristotle, raised a lot of concerns with is this idea of, quote, making the weaker argument the stronger, right? That rhetoric is not necessarily about truth. Rhetoric is about conveying information persuasively that might or might not be true. And we see a lot of this in discussion about facts, about what we consider to be facts, about identifying false information, figuring out how factual claims are supported, and so on. So I highlight that to kind of add to some of the challenges that we have with making persuasive communication when there are oftentimes some of those differences. So that kind of goes over a lot of the things that I wanted to mention about rhetoric. And again, I think a lot of those core ideas, including if it's review for you, are useful in thinking about communication and social change. And I want to shift gears to talk a little bit about this Griffin piece and some of the things that I think this adds to thinking about social change, right? At the beginning of last class, I asked you to think about some social movements and think about some of the ways in which these movements can be understood. A lot of the examples you all brought up. Again, thinking about women's rights, civil rights, and other issues, right, are examples of what Leland Griffin might call the rhetoric of historical movements. So this was written quite a long time ago, but I think it's useful to set the stage for where we were before this point. When we studied social change, when we studied social movements, when we studied sort of the reform, revolution, and all of those kinds of things, we oftentimes studied those from the perspective of history, right? If you've taken a history course here at EOU, there's a good chance you've explored some of these or perhaps a variety of other issues. And I think that the historical method of examining issues can be really different than types of questions that communication is interested in, right? History is oftentimes asking what happened, or how are we making sense of what happened, right? Or how is what happened talked about? How do we make sense of the past, right? And I think from the perspective of this class and from communication, one of the things that we're interested in studying and analyzing these movements is, what does this teach us, right? That the tactics and strategies of one movement can be deeply political and deeply connected to other movements. In fact, one of the things that I find interesting are the ways in which language is appropriated or used between movements, and at times, some of the tension that can emerge from those relationships, right? For instance, a lot of the disability rights movement owes itself to issues related to LGBTQ+ rights, talking about sort of bodily autonomy, also a lot of connections to race, right? This idea of ending segregation, right? And that type of language being used to talk about institutionalization. So there are a lot of these types of connections in language choices, but also in tactics, and trying to understand what works, right? If you're involved in things like social media, public relations, and other issues, right? You're put in a position where you are tasked with communicating effectively to a group of people, oftentimes using things like social media, and oftentimes you're given a set of best practices on how to do so. In other words, we'll be looking at a lot of specific movements, right? But we're also interested in the broader question about what understanding a movement tells us about communication and about movements more broadly, right? When we think about movements in the past, unfortunately, the trend at the time, right, in understanding rhetoric and understanding persuasion was this focus on a single speaker, right? And I like to joke that the history of rhetoric were dead white men talking about how great of speakers other dead white men were, right? There is like an absolute like encyclopedia's worth of analysis of Abraham Lincoln speaking at Gettysburg. It is not a joke to describe the amount of like research on that single orator style, right? What Griffin says is that that is not good enough. That doesn't help us to understand communication and persuasion if we focus on one person, right? Yes, there can be one leader or one speaker that might be associated with the movement or catalyze the movement, right? But there's also questions about why we're focusing on that leader and the broader goals or aims of a group, right? So for example, there's been a lot of criticism of how Dr. Martin Luther King is remembered, right? A lot of folks who have criticized what they see as a sort of whitewashing of history in terms of his approach towards civil rights. So there's questions, right, over how we put so much of an emphasis on a single speaker within the larger movement. One of the other things that we also noticed in the emergence of a lot of hashtags and forms of activism is that a lot of them are leaderless, right? Or they have somebody who sparked it, but the kind of movement is no longer theirs and they're the one, right? That oftentimes things will change, adapt, adjust, and so forth. If you think about a lot of the more recent social movements and recent activism, there's a good chance that you would have difficulty naming who created or who started this movement, right? So we've seen that shift even more. So according to Griffin, there are different elements that help to make what we would consider to be a historical movement. One example that I would highlight is the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? This was a proposed pipeline that passed through Indigenous territory. You had a lot of Indigenous activists and sort of allies and advocates who were occupying the space, trying to prevent the pipeline from being built, right? You also had a number of groups who were talking about the importance or significance of building the pipeline. So it could be an example of what we would trace as a historical movement. Part one, people are dissatisfied with their environment, right? That could be in a couple different ways. Either something is changing and they don't like it and they're going to push back against it, right? Or something needs to change that is not currently in effect, right? We need to pass the Civil Rights Act, right? Or we need to prevent this pipeline from being built. People want change from how things would otherwise be. Change can be social, right? Change between people and relationships. It could be economic, talking, for instance, about inflation, talking about wages in the United States. It could be political change, right? A lot of discussion about political revolution and change. It's talked about in the context of politics. It could be a religious change. We see a lot of this in the historical conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, right? It could be intellectual change, right? How do we talk about or think about an issue? We see a lot of this in discussion surrounding topics like gender and sexuality, right? To address the issue. So they don't want this pipeline to be built, and that is the change that people want. Don't build this pipeline. And then according to Griffin, part C is that the movement either succeeds or fails. Either the pipeline is successfully blocked from development and doesn't actually get built, or it is, right? And it does pass through and therefore the movement has failed. So when we think about certain movements and activism, for example, ones like Occupy Wall Street, right? A lot of people like to say that Occupy Wall Street was a failure, it didn't work. And whether or not we consider it a success or failure in many ways depends upon what we perceive as its goals and what it was trying to do. In this way, a historical movement has essentially 3 steps to it. And I'm going to share a short video that talks about what we can consider to be all of these different steps of a social movement in action, connecting to the example of the Arab Spring that I mentioned a little bit last class.
Just outside Sidi Bouzid lies the body of 26-year-old Mohamed Bouazizi in the peace and dignity that eluded him in life. His fresh grave marked only by the Tunisian flag that drapes over it. On December 17th, Mohamed Bouazizi, a single man who had supported his widowed mother and siblings since the age of 10, took to the streets with his fresh produce cart to earn a day's wage.
At around 10 a.m., as he was making his way through the streets, the policewoman began to harass my son, so he called his uncle to help him. She left him alone only to return later to confiscate his cart. Mohammed said no. The policewoman took the fruit, but when she tried to take his scales, Mohammed refused. She slapped him and began to insult and curse his father.
Mohammed, frustrated and ashamed by the public humiliation he endured at the hands of police, set himself on fire outside the local municipality building. His closest friends, anguished by Mohammed's actions, took to the streets and began a popular uprising that lasted for weeks before it toppled the 23-year-old rule of President Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali. In one of the most foretelling moments at the peak of the Tunisian uprising, the soon-to-be ousted president who visited a badly burned Bouazizi in his hospital bed just before he died. Police delivered the body to the family for burial under tight security, a brave news of his death could only fuel the uprising even more. When we wanted to bury him, we wanted to carry his body in front of the municipal building where he burnt himself. The police wouldn't let us. They told us to take his body to a place nobody would see it. The cell phone video given to Al Jazeera by his family shows hundreds of mourners risking the police crackdown to escort the body for burial. Away from the popular uprising, his self-immolation triggered. Bouazizi was a simple and modest man.
Not a single person hated him. He did not have a single fault of bad behavior. He had ambitions that he never achieved. He wanted to get married and have some money to take care of his mother and family.
Outside his family home stands the produce cart from which Muhammad tried to earn a dignified living. And kilometers away, his family, friends, and strangers now come to visit the man whose death, they pray, has given birth to a nation's freedom.
So, right, this case of Muhammad in Tunisia was considered to be the sort of catalyst for the broader Arab Spring, right? And it wasn't just Tunisia that experienced this significant political and social upheaval. In fact, a number of different countries saw significant change, right? Change that impacted millions, change that led to significant death, political change, regime change, and so on, right? If you've been following any of the conflicts in Syria, right, it was catalyzed by the Arab Spring as well, right? And so this is an example of these kind of different steps in action towards social change, right? And in many ways, a very, very clear flashpoint, right? I think what's important to recognize in a case like this one is that the tensions, the conflicts, the issues did not, like, they continued to exist prior, right, to Muhammad. That conflict and tension was there prior and set up this case, right, of him ending his own life in a public display in a way that was considered to be a spark or sort of boiling point for existing conflict, right? In Tunisia, there was already significant political strife, concern over governmental corruption, concern over taxes and taxation in the country, concern over law enforcement and police behavior, right? And this movement caught on because this was seen as a response to that behavior and something that helped to catalyze other people to protest and be involved in the movement, right? So movements don't start from nowhere, right? There is oftentimes that particular flashpoint, boiling point event that is rallying people or getting people at that point, right? Issues surrounding race in America, of course, have existed for centuries prior to the case of George Floyd, right? But there's a particular event that gets a particular movement started. In this case, right, as mentioned, he was a food vendor who protested government corruption, had this encounter with law enforcement, right, and chose to publicly end his own life in the square. And that would be considered to be this moment of inception, right, the start or creation of the movement. Secondarily, we have what is known as rhetorical crisis. Right? And rhetorical crisis concerns this idea that the moment is disrupted or the moment changes due to communication. Right? So, for instance, if a state legislature is going to pass a law, for example, Kansas recently proposed legislation to ban abortion, right? Then individuals might protest or speak out against that legislation, right? There is a response to how things are right now, right? So the fact that things took off, that there were protests, that there were people kind of visiting the Capitol building, right, taking to the streets, are examples of this step of rhetorical crisis as well, right? And one of the things I found interesting in that video is how the government mentioned, not wanting the body to be visible, not wanting the body to be visible in the square, right? But a lot of protesters who wanted it to be there and wanted that visual spectacle to play an impact in their argument. We'll be talking a little bit more later in the term about the impact of visual communication and rhetoric, because it can be incredibly powerful, right? Visual picture tells you 1,000 words. Also, audio footage, of course, as we know, can have a really major impact as well, as we saw with George Floyd, right? And then consummation is, again, this ending period. Does regime change happen? Does the movement succeed? Does it fail? That's considered to be this final stage, right? So inception, rhetorical crisis, consummation. Movement starts, movement has some challenges or some issues, and then the movement ends. That's a very linear way of thinking about it, right? I think that Griffin brings things to the table, but I think the way that he lays out a movement is something that we can kind of pick out of it, right? So let's start with this first step. People are dissatisfied. They're unhappy with how things are. The first question is, who's dissatisfied, right? Because oftentimes in social movements and in challenging political and social situations, individuals have experienced a challenge for a very long time, or have felt excluded from a broader conversation over a longer period of time. For example, right, one of the arguments made by individuals advocating on behalf of missing and murdered Indigenous women is that this is not an issue that only started happening, right? This is a historical problem. So one issue with Griffin's approach is that identifying people are dissatisfied doesn't necessarily get at the ways that individuals have endured historical challenge. How long have they been dissatisfied? Again, is an important consideration. And who do we consider to be or include under being dissatisfied, right? Who is getting the attention, who's getting the spotlight, media coverage, and so on, especially with as much media and as many headlines as we have right now, right? Getting that attention and getting that initial spark, going viral, that can be a challenge. People want change to address their dissatisfaction, right? What is the change that people want, right? That's a really major concern when thinking about a whole range of different issues. So for instance, in thinking about social change that led to the Supreme Court case of Obergefell versus Hodges, which helped to legalize same-sex marriage, right? The purpose of much of marriage equality or of activists in that time period was that specific legislation, right? However, you had members of the LGBTQ plus community who said, our priority is not necessarily this, right? But instead, maybe we should be focusing our efforts on employment discrimination, right? So the change that people want and the divisions within a group as to which change impacts which people the most can be a really major concern. Who is picking the agenda or determining the issue at the top of the docket? What are the internal divisions, right? I think Griffin assumes that people want change in kind of a monolith, when a lot of times the change people want differs depending on the person, right? And then lastly, does the movement succeed or fail? Well, there's a few different questions. How do we measure success? Do we measure success as this thing passed or this thing failed? Or do we talk about this idea known as consciousness raising for education? Are people more aware of this topic? Are people more informed of this topic? And so on, right? In thinking about Black Lives Matter, right? Do we consider it to be successful? Do we consider it to be a failure? Well, that depends upon how you're measuring those things, right? And who succeeds? Again, depending on the agenda, depending on the issues the group has, what are the issues or topics that benefit certain people more than others? So I think that there are things to push back against, right? That obviously this was written well before we had access to social media, and that's changed a lot of things. But I also think that the kind of very linear way of thinking about social change is a model that we can continue to try to push back against today. So according to Griffin, we have this 2x2 quadrant, okay? So we have what is considered to be a pro movement or an anti-movement, right? A pro movement is in favor of changing or implementing something, right? So you are in favor of something if you are a pro-movement. So for instance, if you were advocating on behalf of the Dakota Access Pipeline, you'd be considered a pro-movement. If you're an anti, right, you are against whatever proposed change or action is happening, right? So if you are against the pipeline, you'd be considered an anti-movement. There's also what's known as an aggressor versus defendant, right? So the aggressor is the person who is initiating the change or initiating the kind of controversy on the issue that is asking us to think differently than we are right now on something. And then the defendant, of course, is the one who is asking us to continue to think about something the way that we are, right? So this kind of creates this 2x2 where a pro-aggressor is trying to get us to think about new things, think about something in a new way, right? Recontextualize something. An anti-aggressor is opposing ideas that are being brought to the table, right? A defendant, pro, is defending that we should accept these new ideas or thoughts at the table. And an anti-defendant says that we need to keep the current ideas as they exist. Right? So that helps us to kind of understand where we might place particular movements. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to use this quadrant a little bit and do a short activity in a group in which I'm asking you to think about a historical movement that could fit into each of these 4 categories. So I'm going to split you off into a couple groups here in just a minute. And for each group, right, have somebody who's willing to write or type for your group and think about what you would consider to be an example in each of those 4 different areas. So it looks like we've got about 14 people, so or about 13 or 14 people. So let's do the easiest way to do it would just be to have a team here on this side, and then we'll have a team here on this side. So feel free to introduce yourselves again, have somebody who can write or type for your group, and have somebody who is able to share for your group in just a bit. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about this and to think about some examples that could fit in these different categories. Yeah, so think about a movement that could fit in. Yeah, yeah. Okay. And it could be like a side of it.
I took a screenshot.
And that was just to show people ideas.
wanting. Yeah. It's a new idea. No.
I'm like getting better at this.
Don't.
It might help to think about like aggressors versus defendants is like kind of think about like this case court where you have a prosecutor defendant. You have the person who's bringing the thing to the table, the person who is sort of defending or responding to that.
So,
It can get blurry, right?
Yeah. Aggressors and emotions of
Aggressive be like things to the table and then be like dirty there.
No. So yeah, yeah.
It's like obviously, so that one's very traditional.
So I'm noticing folks are having challenges with placing these into the floor, right? Which can be difficult and kind of distinguishing some of these. So I thought I'd look back to what Griffin has to say on how we can kind of separate these out a little bit. So aggressor orators and journalists are those who attempt in the pro movement to establish and in the anti movement to destroy. Okay, so aggressors are either creating these new ideas, trying to destroy or oppose them. And then defendants are people who in the pro movement try to resist reform, right? So who are kind of defending, and then in the anti-movement are defending institutions, right? It is kind of vague, right? And I think that there are a lot of movements and advocacy that can kind of blur a bit between these four. So let's talk a little bit about this and some of the things that you all saw as maybe fitting into some of these categories. So let's start here on this side. What were some of the things that you all were chatting about?
Well, we were talking about, we were trying to distinguish like abortion laws. And I guess in all reality, I feel like we can go like either way on this, depending on kind of which way you sway. But also, I think what we're trying to like figure out is like which idea came first.
Right.
Pro-choice versus pro-life. And I feel like pro-life was the more traditional idea. That's always been, I guess, kind of a more traditional route. And then pro-choice kind of came into effect after. So we're kind of having a distinction of which was the idea brought to the table.
Sure. Right. So finding the origin point can be challenging. I think one thing that is useful to kind of help with this is figuring out what the origin was when a movement started, right? So if like abortion was not legal, or was not a practice, right? That a movement kind of started changing that initial idea, right? So I think
we got pro-choice as the pro-aggressor because that was a big idea. Sure. Abortion weren't legal yet in the very beginning.
And if we think about like analyzing sort of movement and advocacy now, it's flipped. So I think that, well, it's also not depending on the state, right? A lot of the states have trigger laws in place. So it becomes challenging, and I think really requires us to think about context. What is the location or space in which that change is happening relative to where things are right now, right? So I think that's an important consideration as the context of the status quo and understanding the history of the moment to know what direction the change is going or who is proposing change. But here on this side.
Okay, we were struggling to figure these out. But for the first one, initiating acceptance of ideas, we put Indian segregation, like the civil rights movement. And then for opposing convention ideas, we said like gun control. Then for defending accepting ideas, we said LGBTQ+ rights. And then defending current ideas, we said women's rights.
Okay. Right. And again, I think that, context and situation matters. I think that, again, the way that Griffin lays this out has been made much more complicated by obviously distinctions between states, distinctions between countries and organizations, right? This question of where are we, who wants this change, where is that coming from, et cetera. That's not an easy thing to map. I think there might be perhaps better models on how to map this that we can explore going forward, right? So what I do think is the useful and kind of valuable thing to take from this is that understanding history and context, of course, matters to understand where advocates and activists are coming from and the starting point of change, right? We tend to oftentimes think about social and political change in the context of what's known as inertia, right? Objects at rest, stay at rest, objects in motion, stay at motion. In many ways, social and political change is inertial. You have to have a reason to change your view or change your perspective or change legislation if we're going to do it, right? We're not just going to change something all the time. We're more compelled to keep things how they are and keep the status quo unless there is a compelling case made to change the status quo. I think that's a useful way of thinking about the burden of proof that's placed onto movements to change from where things are right now. There's a couple things I'm going to go over really quick, and I'm going to ask you to return to your groups for a short activity here at the end. So right? According to Griffin, we persuade within a historical movement in order to move the public before they become alien, right? So there's an Aesop's fable that I think Griffin is trying to use, and you might agree or disagree, but it's the story of the wind and the sun. Have you heard this one? Anybody who's heard this one, right? So the wind and the sun are having a contest over who can take off the person's coat, right? The wind blows and blows and blows to try to get the coat off of the person, and he just holds his coat tighter, or he zips up his coat, right? The sun comes out, the sun just kind of is bright, and on his own, right, the person chooses to take off his coat. And the sort of moral or idea behind this is that if we are pummeled with a message and given a message every single day, or we're shown it everywhere, that will gradually develop a distaste or alienation from that message that will make us less persuaded by it, right? My internet service in the Grand used to be Spectrum. I did not enjoy having Spectrum internet, and Spectrum will not stop spamming me trying to get me to come back, right? And I become frustrated because they try to keep contacting me. So trying to move publics on issues before they grow tired of those issues is a concern for Griffin, right? We have to think about how over time a message can be strategic and effective. We all really feel annoyed during something like election season because we get so many calls, we get so many ads, we just want it out of our heads, right? So according to Griffin, figuring out the frequency and timing of these messages is important. I think a lot of contemporary activists and advocates push back and say, no, we need this message to be constantly reinforced or it's going to get lost in the sea, right? So Griffin says we can understand a movement and understand social change by imagining ourselves in the moment. If we are there or we imagine the time, that's useful, right? I think it's important when we're understanding the past and we're understanding certain historical and social movements that, you know, it's important to consider the resources and available means of persuasion that are there at the time. In, you know, the 1950s, we don't have social media and we can't necessarily mobilize and organize in the same ways. So what were people doing? How are they doing that, right? Presentism is the notion of applying the sort of values or assumptions of the present to the past. And that can hurt our ability to fully understand what a movement is doing. And again, speaks to the generational divides that certain movements and their members can have. According to Griffin, you can consider what's persuasive about the movement, the messages that circulate within the movement, and which of those messages had some type of impact or meaning. Again, we hear over and over again refrains, hashtags, campaigns, efforts that usually boil down to a sentence or a phrase, right? Bands off my body is an example of that phrase being used over and over again within a movement. And according to Griffin, right, it's like threading a needle. We're trying to thread and understand a movement over time. And again, I think that there are elements that are useful about this framework. I think it helps us to think about the past and how the past can shape how movements work. But I do think that, especially in media, there are things that we can kind of critique. So what I want you to do is to think back to one of the movements that you put together on Monday, and return to the groups that you were working with just now. And I want you to think about one of those movements that we talked about on Monday or that we put together on that list. I still have it linked there in the front. And I want you to think about what communication would you say has emerged in that movement, what you would or wouldn't consider to be persuasive in that movement, and what is it about this that makes you define it as a movement. Okay. So we had that list that was brainstormed on the front that had a lot of different examples of organizations and groups. Some of the examples on there were civil rights, environmentalists and activists, LGBTQ, Black Lives Matter, women's movement, et cetera. So I'd consider kind of thinking about some of those and picking one for your group that you might be interested in looking into that.
The very top of the first page.
Like using the environment as evidence. We talked a little bit more about that when we talk about place and space. Go ahead and wrap that. All right. So let's start by hearing on this side about some of the things that you all discussed, some of the things that came up.
right, so we chose Black Lives Matter. And for the first question, we said that there was both large and small protests in person, and then social media was largely used to spread awareness about it. And then what we think makes it a movement and is persuasive is that it plays into people's emotions and it makes sure that it's not just a random person, it's someone's kid, parent, friend that is being affected by this. And that everybody saw it happen, and like the videos are like spread around social media, and so everybody gets to see it kind of with like their own eyes, if that makes sense. And then what makes it a movement is that it's a large group of people trying to bring attention to what has happened in the past and what is still happening, and they want things to change in regards to police brutality.
Yeah. So you mentioned the role of immersion. The history department at EOU actually last year, they might still be doing this, has created sort of this initiative to use virtual reality to like communicate about segregation and about slavery, right? And is trying to kind of provide a more integrated experience into understanding that history, right? I think the role of immersion, the role of circulation, the feeling of being there, right, when there's something like police cam footage, that information, I think, is appealing to and addressing emotions in a way that we see that's very different than the past. And it's really contributing to some of the sort of affective, emotional reaction that can galvanize a movement, for sure. How about here on this side?
So we did like environmental one, and so the patterns of communication that we have a lot of media influence, social media influence. We also have celebrity influence, and a big activist like in the money from Bloomberg. She's kind of like the things of that like as of right now, and she's also someone that's around our age that's pushing this movement. And also, I think it's become a really big political debate as well. So politics play into this. And then for what is and isn't persuasive, we put like statistical evidence and also just like our physical environment. I think we can all see how pollution is affecting either our health ourselves or other people's health around us. And we can also see kind of just differences in climate. And then also, like I said, health effects. And then some things that might not be so persuasive is like money, like how much money you put into this. And or like what is affecting how money is affecting others. Also, like global warming contention, some people believe in global some people don't. So because how do you use that if people don't believe in it? And also age difference. We talked about how if some people are older, they're like, well, I'm gonna die anyway, so it doesn't matter what happens to the environment. And then why is the movement? We have I guess a lot of like pollution and environmental change coming to spark. Protests started to become a thing and activism, like you said, with Bloomberg. And so they kind of are the ones keeping us going, and then we don't know if it's also yet.
Yeah, I mean, the environmental movement is massive, right? And one of the most persuasive examples of this in Salt Lake City, where I lived for several years, was the Great Salt Lake is drying up, right? And there's a lot of chemicals kind of at the bottom of the lake that could go out into the atmosphere and impact the air quality in the city. So there's been an interesting push toward environmental change in conjunction with that kind of crisis point. So I really appreciate both groups sharing these examples, right? I don't think Griffin is a perfect piece. I think there are some challenges and things that are outdated. But I think this gets us starting to think about and develop a framework for analyzing social change and social movement. So we talked about that. We talked about rhetoric and some of the ways that we can understand these movements. So when we meet next Monday, we're going to be looking at persuasion a bit more and how it's used to enact social change. So please pass forward the group's work. Make sure your group's names are on it for attendance. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I will see you next week. We'll pick up on things from there.